most of this time for your questions. Let me just give you a quick intro of who I am. I am, given that you're going to school here, probably your representative. I represent the 19th Congressional District here in California. I have been a representative for this area since 1995, January 4th. Prior to that, I served on the Board of Supervisors of Santa Clara County. Prior to that, I'd done a variety of things. I was on the San Jose Evergreen Community College Board, which is not a full-time position, it's a volunteer position. I practiced law, I did immigration law. I founded a nonprofit housing corporation, and I worked for my predecessor in office, Don Edwards, for almost 9 years. I grew up in the Bay Area, in a very regular family. My dad was a beer truck driver. My mother was a cook in a high school cafeteria and later a secretary. I was fortunate that I was able to get a scholarship, and I went to Stanford University as an undergraduate, and that opened a lot of doors for me, and I'm sure you're all thinking ahead to go into college, which is, I think, the case. After I graduated from college, really, I didn't have no idea what I was going to do. I know young people today have plans, and they're way more careful than I was. So I just went to Washington. I didn't have a job, I didn't have a place to live, and just thinking I would have an impact somehow. And I was lucky to talk my way into a job in Don Edwards' office. So that's how I got my professional start. While I was working for Don Edwards, I met my husband, fell in love, we got married. I had a son and a daughter while I was serving on the Board of Supervisors. They're both adults now. They both live in San Jose. My daughter had twins 3 years ago, so that's the most exciting thing in my world. In the Congress, I serve on a variety of committees, and much of what we do in the House flows from the assignments, the committee assignments that we have. I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and I have ever since the beginning. I'm the senior Democrat on the Immigration Subcommittee, which takes a huge amount of my time. And I also serve on the Intellectual Property Committee, which is very important to this region because it's patents and copyrights and protection of intellectual property, as the name would suggest. I also serve on the Science and Technology Committee, and I also serve on the House Administration Committee. It's unusual for people to serve on 3 committees. I do because House Administration is selected by the senior Democratic leadership. It's very small, and it has jurisdiction over running the House, as well as the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, and elections. You can find, I probably have looked at my website on the things that I care about, the stands that I've taken. As you know, we have elections coming up in a very short order, and although it's nowhere in the Constitution, political parties, in fact, are the organizing tool for the Congress. So which party is the majority determines who chairs committees, what the membership is, who the speaker is, what measures can be heard. So it is possible that the current configuration, which has the Republicans setting the agenda in both the House and the Senate, could change, and that might give different opportunities to advance certain policies that we differ with them on. With that, I'm going to turn to you. That's my 5-minute spiel on who I am. To your questions, anything I can answer, and I can also use advice. So who's going to go first? Don't be shy, because you're reporters. Guy in the pink shirt. Why not you?
So I'm actually not part of the journalism class.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just came here because I was interested.
Well, good.
But like, I'm sure that there are other people in the class. I know I'm good friends with Justin, Colleen, and Keith over there. They're
So we should turn the finger to them.
outside of, you know, your actual job, like personally, what does it mean to you?
Mhm. Well, there are many elements to the position. I mean, the obvious is you go and you vote on things. So it's a constant, you have to make decisions all day long on amendments, on bills, what to introduce, how to vote on bills that are before you. And that's important because it's the laws of the country. But I think being a representative is not just that. You know, people sometimes say, well, you ought to do what your constituents want. And that's easier said than done because I've got, you know, 780,000 people I represent. They don't agree with each other on everything. There's no actual way to query people on many of the issues we vote on are obscure. No one is paying attention to them, but I still have to make a decision. So it's a combination of trying to make sure that what I do is in the best interest of the people I represent. There are occasions where public opinion in my district is one way, but I think the nation needs me to do something else. That rarely happens. I'm trying to think of a good example. I think the Iraq War might have been an example. Public sentiment was high. I didn't do polling in the district, but in the country, people were in favor of invading Iraq. I spent a lot of time. I went over. Condi Rice was then the National Security Advisor. She and George Tenet, then the CIA director, brought me in, you know, to give me all the evidence, which was nothing. And I mean, when all was said and done, I couldn't see that they had made a case. And so I voted against doing it. A vote I do not regret. So you have to do what's in the best interest of the country, what your constituents want you to do. And then there's a whole component. I've got two of my staff back here. Raise your hands. And Angela, who help people. You know, the other day I was at a school and a girl came up and she hugged me and started crying and said that we had helped her family save their home during the mortgage crisis. We did that for people. I mean, the banks treated people just appallingly bad. And we went to bat for people, and we fought the banks, and we were successful in some ways. So we do that. Not only, that was probably not in our portfolio, but we want to stand up for people that are being trampled by big entities, governmental or private. And you know, that's a component of representing people as well. I guess that wraps it up. All right, who else has a question?
In journalism, I should be furious note-taking. We talked about this.
Yes,
Okay, I have a two-part question.
sure.
So the UN states that forcibly
I'm sorry.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah, but I didn't hear the first
All
part.
right, sorry. The UN states that forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is a form of genocide. With that being said, do you consider the DHS's policy of separating children from their families at the border to be genocide?
Right.
And if yes, would the Democrats take over the House as the head of the immigration subcommittee, would you set up an investigation into that policy?
Well, let me answer it. First, as I understand it, the UN position on genocide and the removal of children is rooted in this, that you're taking children from a disfavored group as a government and you're, you know, killing the adults and taking the children and putting them with someone else. It's part of eliminating a group identity. That's not what DHS did. What they did was wrong and immoral, but it wasn't the genocide provision. The UN has condemned, I believe, at least members of the UN have condemned it. I have condemned it. I've been down to the border and been to see the immigration prisons. It's really a tremendous stain on this country, what happened there. There's been no oversight. The Republicans, you know, set the agenda. We've had no hearings, no oversight of what happened there. We've introduced bills to preclude this type of activity, and none of them have been advanced by the Republicans, who again control the agenda. I would hope that if we have the opportunity, that we will shed light on what happened there, take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. If you take a look at not the Republicans in the Congress, but voters, I mean, even Republican voters in the country thought that was wrong. I mean, some people thought it was okay. I don't understand that. The trauma done and persistent trauma done to children separated from their parents is something that those families will be suffering from for a long, long time. Now, having said that, there's there's the three branches of government. You all studied government here. There's the ledge branch, which is the first, and then there's the executive and the judiciary. The executive runs the government, not the Congress. I mean, we pass the laws, we can oversee the administration of the laws, but we don't actually administer the laws. So there is tremendous discretion in the immigration law on the part of the executive branch. And one of the things I hope we can take a look at is how to put some order and some law and some due process into that whole system. I don't know, you didn't ask this, but I'll tell you, part of the solution on that is to have an immigration courts that are actually independent. Right now we have kangaroo courts, the Attorney General, and he can do this because of the way we've crafted the system. He basically is redeciding these cases himself because he's anti-immigrant. I'm in the midst of drafting a bill that would pull the immigration courts out of the Department of Justice, make them independent, and so that people could actually get due process, not some kangaroo court process. So I think that would help in many ways, including the issue of the children separated from their parents. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Who else has a question? I won't hurt you. Yes?
Keith from Summit News. As a woman, have you faced discrimination within Congress?
Sure. I don't complain about it because I've never been a man in Congress, so I have no comparison. But I do think women in professional roles sometimes face barriers, and I'm not exempt from that. Especially some of the older guys, but not only them, have a hard time dealing with women who have authority. I remember Henry Hyde, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee for a number of years, had a real problem. And my attitude, I mean, I can't change Henry Hyde or these guys, I mean, they are who they are, is to be so prepared that I have to be taken seriously. One of the things that I do, it's very hard to tell, looking at the Congress, who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. Because there's staff, right? And you can read the index cards that your staff wrote you and sound like you know what you're talking about, or you can actually know what you're talking about. I strive to be the latter person, so that if there is a brief that we are going to file, an amicus brief, I read the amicus brief. I bring edits. I read not just the footnotes, but the cases that are cited in the footnotes, so that when the topic comes up, I actually have something to say that I know about. And that actually is a very useful tool to countering people who want to be dismissive of you because of your gender. I have. Who else? Yeah.
Parker, I'm Parker from Summit News. Why, in your personal opinion, as you stated on your website, gun violence is so terrible to our economy or our Congress?
Well, we have the worst gun violence of any modern nation. As no one is even close to us. And if you take a look, people who are proponents of weapons say, well, it's mental health, or it's this or it's that. I mean, other modern nations have mental health issues as well. We're the only one that has mass shootings. And there's a reason. It correlates to the availability of automatic weapons in particular. We have a Second Amendment. Other countries who are modern developed nations don't have constitutions as we do. We are bound by the Constitution, and so whether it was wise or not for the founders to put it there is not really the issue. It is there. However, I don't think that the Second Amendment requires assault weapons. That hasn't been completely tested yet by the Supreme Court, nor does it require magazines that have, enough rounds to wipe out this classroom. So I think regulation of armaments that are really weapons of war would make the country, and especially students, a lot safer, and it's something I promoted. Now, we're not getting anywhere with that. The NRA and their other gun rights groups have successfully, they have tremendous influence on the Republican side of the aisle. And their position is nothing. They fight against anything happening, and they've always gotten their way in the Congress when the Republicans had the majority. Whether, it's interesting, because we don't know what's going to happen in the midterm elections right now. It could be that the Republicans maintain control of both the House and Senate, and of course the White House. Or Democrats could take the House and not the Senate, or the House and Senate but not 60 votes. No one thinks we'll get 60 votes. If you have the majority of half of one branch of government, you're not running the train. I mean, you're not going to be able to do everything, but will we be able to do some things, reach consensus on something, is my hope. So, and that would be one of them. Because, if you go to gun owners, again, not the NRA, not the Republican House members, but the American people, they really don't think you need an assault weapon to go deer hunting. People have been made afraid that somebody's coming for their shotgun. That has not actually ever been proposed. It's to do some control over these automatic weapons and who can get hold of them that we're pursuing. Does that answer your question? Good. Who else? If you move, you get called on.
There's also a hand right over here.
Oh, I didn't see it.
My name is Tosh with 7 News, and I was wondering, in your opinion, what's the most challenging side to being a politician?
Most challenging. Well, I feel fortunate to have the job. I mean, I don't have to do it. I put my name on the ballot and asked to be elected, so I don't complain about the things that are not as much fun as other things. In terms of the things that are, the least fun about the job is the commute. I have to leave my house at 5:30 in the morning, drive to San Francisco, fly to Dulles Airport, drive into the Capitol, and get there just in time for votes at 6:30. I'll do that on Tuesday, and then as soon as the last vote is over, I turn it around, and sometimes you can't get out to San Francisco, so recently I've been connecting through Los Angeles up to San Jose. I mean, it's a hassle and makes you tired too. And the time change, people say, well, how do you get, used to the time change? You never do. If you leave on Tuesday and come back on Thursday or Friday, you're just starting to get used to it, then you return. So I come home every week, and that is not the most fun part of the job. One of the things that's disappointing, and I don't blame people, but people are skeptical. You come in and you say, here's my agenda, and they want to go, what's the deal? I mean, that's a healthy thing in a democracy for people to be skeptical, but you also want to be able to work with people and have consensus and achieve mutually agreed upon goals. So sometimes cynicism can be disappointing, and apathy can be disappointing, and people who think, well, nothing I do will matter. Who's here is old enough to register to vote? And who has registered to vote? We can now, register before you turn 18, if you'll be 18 by the time the election day arrives. Young people don't vote in large numbers. And the reason why from the polling is that they don't think their vote will make a difference, which is so untrue. In Virginia this last year, there was a fight for the governor's race, which the Democrat won. The Republicans controlled the Virginia House and Senate by huge margins. And there was a grassroots effort, and the Virginia House became Democratic majority, and the Senate, and it came down to a tie vote. And they had to flip a coin for the control of one house of the Virginia legislature. I mean, that's how big one vote is. So people who work together to a common goal can have tremendous impact. And, you know, the government does matter in our lives. I mean, whether it's immigration or transportation or housing, these things can matter. And, you know, people in elected office are far from perfect. Most of us do the best we can. But we need input and guidance from the people who elect us, and we get a hiring decision every other year. So I hope people will participate. Yes?
I'm Avi from Summit News. How do you believe that California and the United States can help corporations switch over to renewable resources, including sources of energy?
That's a very good question. California actually has been a leader in this. As you know, the state passed a law that we will have 100% renewable energy in California. I think the year is 2054. We set a goal of 30% for I think it was 2022, and we met it already. So these are, you set goals and then you let the technology chase the goal is the best way to do it, rather than, I believe, have mandates on the processes. Contrary to what California is doing under the Trump administration, we're backpedaling in the other direction. They are trying to, when the Clean Air Act was passed, there was a provision that allowed California to set its own vehicle emission standards because pollution was such a problem. And so California really ratcheted down the emission standards, which has helped. I mean, you're too young to remember this, but there was a time when you couldn't see across the valley because of the pollution. And if you went to LA, I remember I went to LA once, where Orange County, where my aunt and uncle lived, you couldn't see across the block because of the smog was so dense. That's gone now. I mean, it's not perfect, but it had huge positive impacts. And now the Trump administration wants to eliminate California's exemption so that our stricter standards would no longer be viable. We'll litigate that, we'll sue over that, at least the state of California will. And all the other provisions, you know, it's not just setting standards, but also funding research. When Obama was president, we had a whole clean energy research program in the Department of Energy for clean fuels, for electric vehicles, for you know, the cheapest thing and the easiest thing is buildings. Buildings use half the energy in the United States. And there are really very smart, easy ways to bring the energy use down. I was at NASA Ames earlier this week, and they have done something that's very clever on their supercomputer system, which just, I mean, supercomputers suck energy because you've got to keep it cool, because they went from 33% to 2% because of the technology they've deployed on their supercomputers in terms of energy use. So it's very important because of climate change. And I mean, it is absolutely clear, the overwhelming scientific evidence and our own eyes will let us know that climate change is not only a problem that's happening now, it's accelerated, and it is caused by humans' use of energy. I have colleagues on the science committee who do not believe that climate change is real. They think it's a democratic hoax. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the things they say. So if you know, it's one thing to say, let's work together on common problems. If you don't even think it's a problem, it's hard to get to the point where you work together commonly. So that is the problem that we have at the federal level, and California doesn't have that problem. They see it, they're moving forward. And actually, I give the governor and the legislature credit. They're trying to lead the world. They had this summit in the face of the federal deficit. They're trying to step forward and play a positive role. I give them a lot of credit for that. Yes?
I'm Max from Summit News. I was just wondering to what extent do teens and adolescents influence your actions as a politician, and how does this compare to the politics as a whole?
Well, whenever I'm invited to a school, I try and go, and I try and listen to students. Whenever I get a letter or an email from a student, I listen to what they say and I pay attention to it. I also take positions that I'm so disappointed that the governor vetoed Senator Portantino's bill yesterday. I had a bill I introduced first in 1998, and I'll admit that the beginning of it was my own son and daughter. Elementary schools at San Jose Unified started at 9:05. It's like, what working parent can get their 6-year-old to school at 9:05? Whereas the high school began, my son was taking trigonometry at 7:05 in the morning. And he was not awake. The teacher was, I mean, it was a catastrophe. And I thought, why are we doing this? Why are we making these young people? And then they couldn't get up. My kids couldn't get up. I thought, am I a bad parent? I mean, what has happened here? And so I did some research. And starting with Dr. William Dement at Stanford, at the Stanford Sleep Institute, and his brilliant student, Dr. Mary Carscarden at Brown University, who is a specialist on adolescent sleep. And what the scientists have discovered is that around the time you hit puberty, the secretion of melatonin changes. And that it's very difficult for most teenagers to go to sleep before 11 o'clock. As a consequence, it's not their fault, it's biology. At the same time that's happening, we're making the school start day for those very students earlier for no apparent reason. While that's happening, adolescent sleep need accelerates. 9 or 10 hours is best for an adolescent in terms of best health. So I introduced a bill called the Z's to A's Act, because the schools that changed they saw these things. Academic performance went up for students, the number of auto accidents went down, student suicide attempts went down, student depression went down, and I thought such a simple change for such positive results. So that was something I've introduced. The Congress can't decide school start times. That's, you know, for the states and localities. But it was a resolution urging that they do it. Every time I'd introduce it, some talk show would call me up and I would talk about the scientists, and then they would call the scientists and information would get out, and school districts changed. The state of California, the legislature passed a thing for California high schools not to start before 8:30, but the governor vetoed it yesterday. So we're going to try again next year with the new governor. Does that
Yes,
make sense? Okay. Who else? With the Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, 2 out of 24. And that's the only time when you really have a clear shot at getting something done. We did the Affordable Care Act in that 2-year period. It was not a perfect bill, it was what we could get the votes to do. And it did a lot of things. It expanded coverage greatly. Millions of people who had never received health care coverage finally got it. It also prohibited discrimination in health care insurance for people who had a pre-existing condition. And if you live to be 40, you will have a pre-existing condition. It also eliminated, this is something that used to happen and it surprised people, there would be lifetime caps that many people would be unaware of. And so if you had a serious illness, once you hit that dollar cap, the insurance would no longer pay for you, even though you had been paying in for the premiums. There were some problems that we needed to fix. And one of the problems is that we did not have, we didn't tier the costs to high cost of living areas. And so, I mean, for example, you live in San Jose and you live in a house that Zillow tells you would sell for $800,000. It doesn't mean you're rich. What matters is what's your disposable income? What do you have to spend? And so people in the Midwest, they think, you know, somebody who's earning, you know, $100,000 a year here is like massively wealthy, whereas I know it's very tough, actually, with housing costs to get by at that. So we need to tier that, and I think we did something else that we need to reinforce, which is the Medicaid expansion, which is supposed to be for people who are not wealthy, needs to be upped more than we did in terms of the income. Ultimately, there's a lot of sentiment, and I'm one of them, that the country would be better off if we had a Medicare-like system for the entire population. We're not going to be able to do that overnight, honestly, although a lot of people think we could, because people are very nervous about their health care. They don't want big changes that will adversely impact their family. It's totally understandable. But if we could, people who are in Medicare love Medicare, and it is a lot less expensive to administer than private insurance. It's, you know, the overhead is like 2, 3, 4% as compared to the insurance companies, way bigger. And when you talk, you know, some people say, well, we don't want the government running our health care. Well, I mean, you don't want the insurance companies running your health care either. I mean, so I think what I'm hoping we can do, but we'll see. I mean, it depends on, you know, Trump will still be president, what he thinks, what the margins are, if there's a change, is to allow people to start buying into Medicare. If we lowered the age limit on Medicare to 50 and let people buy into that system, it would improve the, there's something called adverse selection in insurance, where the people who are sickest go to and create adverse pools, because insurance is about having a lot of people so you share the risk, and if you have riskier people in that pool, it makes it more expensive. So what we've got in the ACA pool is the older people tend to be more expensive, the younger people less expensive because they're healthier. If the older cohorts in the ACA system over 50 bought into the Medicare system, it would improve the pool on ACA. Interestingly enough, it would also improve the pool on Medicare because those are the youngest older people. So allowing that to happen and for people to make their own decision, not get forced to do it, is one way to start moving in the right direction. And you could make that available to private sector insurers too. Most people get their insurance through their place of employment. And if you allowed that buy-in in the private sector as well, you would start moving people in that direction. You'd lower costs considerably. And I think people's satisfaction would be much higher than it is today. Does that answer your question? Right.
If you're visiting and you have a question, please feel free to jump in. I think we've gotten to most of our journalists at this point.
Hi, Yasin. My name is Senior. I have a few questions that you can answer.
Sure.
How do you think we as students can contribute to your mission?
That's a very nice question. Well, there's different ways. I think speaking out on things you know about is a really important thing to do. You know, I'm not young now, but I was once. And I remember, you know, wondering whether my voice would count, whether anyone would think what I said would make a difference. And now that I'm not, you know, 18, I realize the voices of 18-year-olds count a lot. You know, let's take a look at what happened in the issue of gun violence. The debate was entirely between adults. There was no traction being gained in terms of any kind of safety measures for students until the survivors of the massacre in Florida started to organize. And they organized using social media, they went on TV, and then young people all over the United States also started speaking out. There was a tremendous rally here, I don't know if any of you went, down at the Guadalupe River Park, organized by students. And you know, it had an impact in the United States. Now, have we achieved our goal yet? No, we haven't. But you know, Abraham Lincoln said public sentiment is everything. Once the public wants to do something, it becomes more possible to do that thing. And so achieving public opinion is hugely important in moving an agenda. There's a lot of issues that I work on, and I find it frustrating that we've not yet succeeded. Immigration is an issue that I think immigration is so important to this country. If you take a look at any area of American life, whether it's business or the arts or government, I mean, immigrants have made a huge positive difference. And take a look at Silicon Valley. Half of the businesses, the tech businesses in the Valley, were formed by an American born somewhere else. You know, where would we be? So that's how I see it. And then I find, you know, guys like Steve King, who serves on the committee from Western Iowa, who's anti-immigrant. I mean, the things he says are just, I won't repeat them because they're so foul. He thinks that any person coming to the United States is stealing a job from an American. It's preposterous, it's not true. So the question is, how can we change opinion on that issue? I was meeting with the American Immigration Lawyers Association earlier this week, and I've been talking to them. There's a program, and you may know people or even be in this situation, called Dreamers, where kids were brought here as children, but they don't have legal status. They're Americans in every way, but they're paperwork. And we talked President Obama into giving them sort of safe status. It was only temporary because he can't change the law, but to provide safe haven for them and allow them, you know, not to live in fear. The American public believes by huge margins, I mean 60, 70, 80%, depending on which poll you look at, these kids should not be rounded up and deported. So why don't we do something about them? Well, there's pockets of people who want to round these kids up and deport them. They think they're criminals. I'm trying to find young people to step forward and put a face on this. Not only those young people, but there's been recent criticism, and some of it is correct, but mainly it's a good program, of people who come on professional visas. You know, let's eliminate them. Well, we're going to close a bunch of hospitals in the middle of America if we eliminate these visas and say all the doctors and nurses have to go back to the country they're from. So I think, you know, pulling faces on, and students can be part of that. I think that, you know, you're not always right any more than the adults, but people are going to give you some respect because if you show the courage to speak up, we all were once your age, we want to respect that. So you have a special stature that you can utilize for whichever subject that you think is most important. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Who else? He's elbowing you to ask another question. Nobody else?
I'll just jump in here.
Sure.
If you've ever seen a White House press conference, those reporters
They're
are...
screaming.
Yeah, that's right. They do everything they can to get the person to answer their question. So bring a little bit of energy, courage, and go for it.
Of course, you know, the president just turns his back on the law. Yeah. Okay, young man.
Avi from Summit News. How can we improve sustainability of waste disposal in a way such that it is cheaper to be sustainable than to be unsustainable?
That's another very good question. I can see you're studying this. There are different waste streams, and I think they need to be analyzed. The waste needs to be seen not as a problem, but as an asset. If you start doing that, you start seeing waste in a different way. A couple of weeks ago, I went out to the water recycling plant that we have here in San Jose. It's worth going to. I arranged a trip. It's fascinating. The water that comes out in its sewage, it's the sewage from the San Jose and other cities, and it is treated so that it's pure enough to drink. As a matter of fact, I did a little promo. I drank the water out of it. It is cleaner than the water we're importing from the Delta. It is cheaper than the plant's desalination. So that's one stream of waste. I mean, we have a drought situation here. We have climate change coming at us. We have just enjoyed water storage in the snowpack for hundreds of years. That snowpack's going to be receding and gone. How are we going to store water? How are we going to get water? Water recycling has got to be part of it. So we need to look at that as an asset and not a problem, and use technology to help solve our problem. In Europe, they're taking trash and making the trash a source of energy, so that there's hardly any waste. We're not doing that almost anywhere in the United States. They see their garbage as an asset and not a problem. And so technology can allow for the reuse of that to produce energy. We have a problem right now on recycling of materials because the United States has just relied on China to recycle our material. Now we're in a trade war, and they don't want to take our plastic or our paper, so it's just piling up. That is useful stuff and needs to be recycled. There needs to be a market for it. And the final thing, and it's not directly on point, we've had a fight back and forth on what to do with nuclear waste. And the point I've been making is they want to dump it all in under some mountain in Nevada. It's like, 100 years from now, we will look at that as a really stupid thing to do. Think back 100 years ago, and what did we know technologically? And then advance 100 years, and that will be a valuable asset instead of a problem. So it may need to be stored in some manner that is consolidated, but it needs to be available to people as technology grows as a resource instead of a problem. I think if we do that on everything and use technology, these wastes become seen as differently. Does that answer your question? You had a question there.
Yeah, I was just wondering what motivated you to go into politics, because from when you started, it must have been really challenging. And number two, how is it different from now, considering all the challenges that are happening now with as women? Is it much different than then? Has it really changed?
Yeah. Well, you know, in terms of how I got interested in politics, I mentioned my parents. You know, they didn't go to college. They were high school graduates. They had, blue-collar jobs. But they, and especially my mother, believed that they were in charge of the government. They were voters. And so we would have, every night at dinner, we'd have discussions about what was going on in Congress or what the president was doing. I remember my mother, I walked my first precinct when I was 5 years old with my mother, because we always walked precincts, whether it was city council or Congress, and she took me to Democratic clubs, to meetings. And I went as a young person. I thought everybody did that. I found out later not everyone did. So it just assumed, I was brought up to assume that the direction of the government was my responsibility. And not alone, but it was partly my responsibility. And so after I graduated from college, going to Washington was fortuitous. Stanford at the time was mainly very wealthy people, and with a few scholarship kids. And so I was one of the scholarship kids. And my friends, their parents were lawyers and, college presidents, and they knew members of Congress. I did not. And so they all had internships lined up through their parents. And I thought, well, I'll just move in. They were driving cross country, and I said, there's room for one more. And I was in the middle, seated back. And my friend had a room in a house, so I asked her if I could stay in her room, which she let me do. And then I just walked around until I got a job on the Hill. And I sort of got the bug in a way. Richard Nixon was president, and there were a lot of problems, but in retrospect, that looks good compared to now. While I was on the staff, I worked on the Nixon impeachment. Actually, while I was a law student, I was sent back to work on the bankruptcy reform bill while all the lawyers were working on impeachment. But the impeachment was like a vortex, you know, it like sucked everyone in. And so I guess, you know, I could have done other things. I mean, the people from my classes at Stanford or in law school earned more money. I mean, they did other things. But I wanted to make change instead of money. And when I married my husband, he's a lawyer, and he's, you know, he's successful. His income supports the family more than mine, and he's a very patient man. He's willing to put up with all of this. And so I love doing it. I love doing it. Now, in terms of the current environment, I think, you know, just my opinion, and you can disagree. I mean, I think this is the worst president in the history of the United States. And the level of non-compliance with statutes is shocking. And it's kind of thrown us all for a loop. I'll give you just a tiny example, but you can see my point. Under the statute, the Secretary of State has to personally meet with the chairman and ranking member, that's called the senior minority member, of the Judiciary Committee and Immigration Subcommittee of the House and Senate before they can set the ceiling for refugee admissions. They have to consult with us. And, you know, John Kerry did, you know, Condi Rice did, you know, all of them did personally come in and meet with us and follow the statute. Last week, they just announced the number without meeting with us. So that's not even a lawful number. Who's going to sue? What do we do? I mean, the Republican members were furious. It wasn't a partisan issue. The president is not, or his Secretary of State, hasn't complied with the law in this and many other ways. How you deal with that has been a very big challenge. You know, that may seem like a small incident, but I mean, there are many others where it's very difficult when an executive branch is not adhering to the requirements of the law. What do you do? What we have done in some ways is reach out to our friends in states who initiate litigation. Javier Becerra was my colleague in the House of Representatives. Javier and I have each other on speed dial. I mean, he's bringing lawsuits, and all successful ones, to stop when the state of California has standing to bring a lawsuit. Individuals are bringing lawsuits, but it's not really the way to run these things. So I've never had a challenge like this in my entire career, both federally and in local government, where I've seen something like this. And any advice you have, I would be more than happy to hear.
Just about 10 more minutes. If you guys haven't gotten questions in and you want to, you have about 10 minutes to do that.
You were going to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to add to that. As a woman, do you feel it challenging to be in the Congress? Does your colleagues actually respect you? Or in this environment, do you find it challenging to be?
I think it is better than when I first arrived. I'll give you a story. I mean, I won the election. Don Edwards was the incumbent. My husband and I flew out to Washington. Don Edwards was very gracious. He invited my husband and me to have lunch with him in the members' dining room. So the three of us are sitting there. Henry Hyde is walking past. He says, "Henry, I want you to come meet the person who's going to take my seat." Henry walks over, he sticks out his hand to my husband to shake it. Right? So from that to current, Nancy Pelosi was Speaker. That changed a lot because the Speaker is second in line to the presidency after the Vice President. It is the most powerful position in Congress. She's fabulous, by the way. People have all these ideas about her. I mean, she is totally, you know, back to your energy question, if we could plug into Nancy, our energy problems would be over. It's unbelievable. No one can keep up with her. She's smart. She's playing three-dimensional chess while everybody else is playing checkers. I mean, it really changed a lot. And a lot of people resented her. They don't like Californians. They don't like San Francisco, they don't like women. She didn't care, she just moved forward and she's the most effective speaker of modern times. So that actually changed things to some extent for women in the House, I think. And also, the times have changed. You know, the men who are 35 were raised with a different point of view than men who are 80, and that's helped. So yeah, I think it's better. Is it perfect? No, but you know, who's better is okay as compared to perfect. Yeah.
One more question. What about the current administration do you agree with and what do you disagree with?
What about the current administration do I agree with, and what do I disagree with? You know, I struggle to find something I agree with them on, to be honest. You know, with George Bush, there were some things I agreed with, and things I disagreed with. And that's true of most of my Republican colleagues, where, you know, we can agree on the Fourth Amendment, but we disagree on some other things. I cannot think of a single policy he's taken offhand that I consider to be a wise one. And I'm sorry to say that. Yeah.
I have a question. Max from Summit News. How has growing up in the Bay Area affected your stance on politics?
Well, I think, you know, we're all a product of our environment. I'm a Democrat. I'm not conservative in most areas. I mean, I'm conservative when it comes to standing up for the Constitution. If that's conservative or liberal, I don't even know if that analysis works on that. But I believe in activism. I believe there's a role for the government to make people's lives better. I know that that happened in my own life. I mean, I got a scholarship, so I got to go to college. That made all the difference for me. My father was in World War II. He got a VA loan so we could have a little house to grow up in. That made all the difference for us. I remember when my dad was unemployed and he got unemployment insurance. That kept us from losing our house and being on the street. So there's a role. My grandmother worked in a factory, in a sewing machine factory, and she lived on Social Security. That was hugely different. She lived, at the end of her life, she lived in senior housing that was subsidized, and that made a huge difference for her. So there's an important role for the government to play to help people be successful, to give them a shot at being successful and having their family move forward. That view is at odds with the view of other parts of the country. If I had grown up in, Texas, in the rural Texas, would I have that same view? I don't know, but I know I wouldn't be elected from rural Texas with that point of view. So I think I more or less, not 100%, match the point of view of the people who elected me. And that tends to be true of the other representatives, where the voters over time select people who kind of have their worldview. We have a very divided country. It's not just the political elected people who disagree. The country has disagreements about where to move forward and how to move forward. And some of that disagreement is related to who's participating in elections. If all the people under 25 voted 80%, the country would be moving in a far different direction than it is today. So I'm glad. I mean, I've lived here all my life. I love this place. We've got problems. The housing costs, we have to do something about this. I mean, young people can't even afford to live here. It's crazy. So, we haven't repealed the law of supply and demand yet. We've got to provide housing and enough housing so that the people who have jobs here can afford to live here. And we've got transportation problems that we need to deal with. And the lack of housing has created other problems that we see every day. Homeless people on the street, which makes us feel that's so wrong. But these are all things we can do something about. They're all things that we could solve working together. Living here, I just think I feel lucky. I won the lottery to be able to grow up here and live here today. Hope you feel that same way.
I've been for 20 years. What are your opinions on, I think it's FEMA and the administration's action they took during Hurricane Maria?
Well, no, the FEMA failed to adequately deal with the Puerto Rico disaster. It was not an easy disaster to deal with. I don't want to downplay that. But they failed to pre-deploy. They failed to marshal sufficient resources after I mean, it was catastrophe. And then they kind of dropped the ball on follow-up. I don't understand the attitude. Those are American citizens. And one of the things I hope that we are able to do at some point soon, the Puerto Rican people have voted several times to become a state. They are American citizens. We should have them become a state, and I think they'll be much better off, be able to have their own taxing authority and get treated properly as other states were after their disasters. FEMA, if it goes wrong, if it's not well organized, it shows up in a disaster, and that's what happened with Maria. The hurricane that destroyed New Orleans is another example. It had tremendous political damage for George Bush. But they were incompetent. He put a guy as head of FEMA who'd been like running racehorses. He had no background in what he was doing, and he flopped, and it showed. So what Clinton did was really good. He took Bill Clinton, when he was president, a guy whose whole life had been emergency management, and they completely reformed the agency so that they could respond. One of the things about emergency management is it needs to be completely apolitical. And if you take a look in the state of California, it is completely apolitical. It's the police, it's the fire, and you have whole protocols that need to be followed, and you need to have people who know what they're doing to follow those protocols, and that did not occur in Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Justin from Summit News. Do you think it's challenging to bring in new laws and bills to support the well-being of our country? Why or not?
It is very difficult to pass laws, and intentionally so. You have the way it's supposed to work. Did we bring the how your laws are made booklet, or just constitutions? Just the constitutions. You can find the how your laws are made online. Don't spend too much time on it, because we no longer do it that way. The way it's supposed to work is a bill is introduced, it's sent to a committee, the chairman of the committee, consulting with the members, decides what to advance, you have hearings, you find